Hey scholars, welcome back to our AP Barron's book review for environmental science. And this week we're talking about populations with chapter 6. We're going to discuss a couple of different topics: population ecology, carrying capacity, reproductive strategies, survivorship, and also the human aspect of populations and how ours has changed over the past years. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today with populations. Population ecology studies the dynamics of species and how these populations interact with the environment. And another way of looking at this is called PVA, and this stands for Population Viability Analysis. So basically looks at how the population ecologically plays a very important role. So for example, the following, it says the table lists and shows those factors that affect population viability, which means how productive will that population be in the environment. Most organisms live in different groups, like flocks, schools, nests. Obviously flocks will be birds, schools will be fish, and nests maybe even larger groups as far as nesting together. And living in groups provides several advantages by increasing protection from predators, allowing increased chance for mating, and probably more to find food sources with division of labor. These different factors, you can see the plus signs on the left-hand side and the decrease signs on the right-hand side, are just looking at how these different things would increase viability or decrease them. So increasing a population's effectiveness would be favorable environmental conditions like light, temperature, nutrients, going to favor that population to flourish. High natality, which means births, lots of births. Generalized niche means they can serve a bunch of different roles in the ecosystem. Satisfactory habitat, which means it's the right spot, the right place for them. Few competitors, so they're not out competing anybody, or they're not in really heavy competition with somebody else as far as a species goes. Suitable predatory defense, which means they have some different things like for instance, porcupines with their quills have some sort of defense mechanism to withstand predatory interaction. Adequate resistance to diseases and parasites, so they have some sort of immune system built up. Able to migrate, so move from point A to point B. Flexible, which means not just flexible, maneuvering wise, but able to adapt to a change in environment. And also sufficient food supply. All those would be increases in the viability of a population, so that they're going to probably do very, very well under those circumstances. Decrease, and a lot of these are kind of the opposite of those. So low natality, so obviously low birth rate, unfavorable conditions, just not the right temperature, soil, pH, etc. Specialized niches means they only have a certain role, and they're the only ones that can. Well, that's the only role that they can serve. And then habitat is not really satisfactory as far as what they're trying to get to. That kind of goes back into that first bullet there. Too many competitors, so if there's too much competition going on, then they might be outcompeted. Unsuitability for predatory defense, which means they just don't have a good enough defense system, and that means their numbers are going to plummet because of high predation. Little or no suitable defense mechanisms against disease or parasites. Again, they're going to plummet because they have no defense mechanism against those pathogens. And unable to migrate, which means they can't leave. If they can't adapt, they have to migrate, but if they can't do that, then they die. So that would obviously decrease their viability. And then a deficiency of food supply or inflexibility, unable to adapt or change with those conditions. So those are kind of the different factors that would affect if a population is going up or a population is going down. Another topic that you probably learned about in biology, but it's called carrying capacity. We represent it by a K, maybe because it makes the same K sound, I don't know. But carrying capacity refers to the number of organisms that can be supported in a given area sustainably, which means the resources are going to plummet and everything's going to get out of shape. So that is basically the gist of carrying capacity. It can be a number of different things that cause carrying capacity. These are called limiting factors. But they can be, for instance, food availability, space, whether or not enough oxygen is there for them, nutrient levels, amounts of sunlight. All those things can be limiting factors in a population and kind of cause that population to reach carrying capacity quickly. Another topic is called biotic potential. It's in that second paragraph there, right here. Biotic potential is the maximum rate at which a population can grow. It's biotic potential given optimum conditions. It means the best, everything's perfect for them, suited for them to survive. Occurs when our resources are unlimited, which really never happens, but for the most part. If they were unlimited and left unchecked, it would be kind of a J-shaped curve, and you can see this J-shaped curve. We call this an exponential growth curve, where the number just keeps going up and keeps doubling and doubling and continuing to go up in the shape of a J. Predation not only removes very old and very young, the weaker members of the population also may reduce the population of prey. If predators do not keep the prey population in balance, a carrying capacity is exceeded, and the prey may starve, causing a quick drop in that population. So, for instance, this could be a going up, all of a sudden no more food, bloop, drops below, way below carrying capacity, and that's not a good thing for that population either. This is what we call an S-shaped curve. It's more of a logistic growth model curve, and it actually factors in carrying capacity. You can see that it looks like a J all the way up until it reaches the carrying capacity and the population levels off. Now, like I said before, if the predation doesn't really happen nearly as much, you could have this little bouncing around your carrying capacity line, which is relatively normal, but you don't want it to draw, that's called lag time, and you don't want that to go superbly well below, because that can be a problem for that population as well. Reproductive strategies. There's two main reproductive strategies. The first one is the R strategist, and the second one is the K strategist, and we're going to compare both of these today. R strategists are species that have very high reproductive rates. They mature very quickly, which means they can reach adulthood very quickly, means they can reproduce faster. They're very short-lived. They don't have long lifespans, maybe a year at max, if that. Tend to be usually the prey items between the predators and preys. Have many offspring and tend to overproduce. And the reason they overproduce is usually because they don't parent, which says low parental care. They don't parent very well. They can't take care of that many kids. So they just kind of have as many as they possibly can and hope a couple of them make it through. They're generally not endangered. They're not usually endangered. We don't see these guys in the endangered species list much. They widely fluctuate in population density. So they have lots of booms and busts, usually because of environmental factors like temperature. Like for instance, mosquitoes would be a good example of an R strategist. All of a sudden it gets very cold. Their species, the population busts. All of a sudden it warms up and it rains a couple times. Man, they're booming again. So that's an example of wide fluctuations. Population size. Limited by density-dependent limiting factors, like I just talked about, weather, climate, as in my example of mosquitoes, and they usually tend to be smaller organisms. Type 3 survivorship curves is what we'll look at. We'll look at survivorship curves in a second, but that's one of their characteristics. And again, most often include insects, algae, bacteria, rodents, and annual plants, and things like that. Now, on the contrary, K strategists they mature very slowly. They have longer lives, it could be 20, 30, it could be like tortoises, hundreds of years. They tend to be both predator and prey. So we usually, although we saw our strategists mostly be prey, we can see these guys be both. They have only a few offspring, and most of the endangered species on the endangered species are K strategists. Population size stabilized near the carrying capacity, so there are competition between these species. Density-dependent limiting factors like competition, interactions like predation, parasitism, things like that. They tend to be larger in organisms, and they will be type 1 and type 2 survivorship curves. We'll cover that in just a little bit. And examples are us, humans, elephants, cactuses, or cacti, and sharks. Now, before we move on to survivorship curves, I kind of skipped a little section in your book, and it's on one of the famous, population gurus, and he really wasn't, but he really was a political economist. Is a guy by the name of Thomas Malthus. And if you ever take the economy or take any of those kind of classes, you'll learn about him extensively. But he was a guy who was concerned about what he saw with the decline of the living conditions of the 19th century. So living conditions, how people were living, he saw that decline in England. He blamed this decline on three elements. There's three things he said. One was the overproduction of young, which is just overproduction of people. Number two, the inability of resources to keep up with the rise in the human population. And number three, the irresponsibility of the lower classes. He blamed those three things for the overall decline of living conditions in 19th century England. To combat this, Malthus suggested the family size of the lower class ought to be regulated, such that poor families do not produce more children than they can support. In his 1798 book, or essay, it says, Essay on a Population, Malthus hypothesized that unchecked population growth always exceeds the means of supporting a larger population. He argued that the actual population growth is kept in line with the food supply by what he called positive checks, such as starvation and disease, which elevate the death rate, and preventative checks like postpone a marriage, which keep the birth rate down. Malthus hypothesized here's the hypothesis imply that the actual population growth always has a tendency to push above the available food supply. So remember how I talked about that little ripple on top of carrying capacity? He said that is kind of a natural thing there. That's what he hypothesized. Because of this tendency, any attempt to correct the condition of the lower classes by increasing their living standards or improving agricultural productivity would not be possible. Which, if you kind of think about it today, we do a lot to try to increase third world countries' development and things like that, but we haven't been able to do so. Maybe Mathis was kind of right on to something there. As far as Charles Darwin goes, Charles Darwin actually incorporated some of Mathis' ideas in his 1859 book, The Origin of a Species, by stating that limited resources results in competition with those organisms that survive, being able to pass on those adaptations through their genes to their offspring. So, even Darwin used some of Mathis's observations on the classes of individuals in England, and actually was able to take something away from those and use those in his book on evolution. So just kind of an interesting person there that you might want to read a little more. It's in the new edition, not in this edition, but I thought I'd bring it up. All right, so let's get into survivorship curves. Survivorship curves show age distribution characteristics of species, and then also reproductive strategies, and also how the history of the life of that species. So reproductive success is measured by how many organisms are able to mature and then go on to reproduce. Each survivorship curve represents a balance between the natural resource limitations and interspecific / intraspecific competition. For example, humans could not survive at a type 3 survivorship mode, where human females would produce thousands of offspring. I know you ladies could not handle that, and I hear you on that one. Just as I couldn't provide for thousands of offspring. Likewise, ants could not survive at a type 1 survivorship, where each queen ant would only produce a few eggs during her lifetime, where she would spend most of her time and energy raising those offspring. It just doesn't work out. So we've got these kind of survivorship curves. Let's take a look at them up here on the top of this page 145 of this text. Let's start with number 1. Type 1 is man. That is an example of us. We are type 1 survivorship. If you look at the graph, it shows a fraction of organisms surviving. So how many organisms are surviving? Here's birth, and this is the age of the organism, all the way to the maximum lifespan of death. Okay, so you can see that we've got a lot of surviving, and they're surviving and surviving, very long from birth until they reach a certain age and they drop off. That's reaching our maximum life expectancy. So let's say that reproduction occurs fairly early in life. Most deaths occurs at a limited in biological lifespan. Low mortality at birth, which you can see it's obviously at the highest as far as fraction of organisms surviving. High probability of surviving to advanced ages, which we show with this curve all the way getting to here. And death rates increase during older age, which there's that sharp drop in decline in number of organisms surviving at that maximum lifespan. Advances in prenatal care, nutrition, disease prevention, and cures for diseases and immunizations have meant longer lifespans for humans, and that's why we're a great example of a type 1 survivorship curve. Let's take a look at type 2. Type 2 starts off, they're very high at birth, but then they slowly and gradually decline as they get older, as far as in numbers. So number 2 is constant loss, and the examples are songbirds. Individuals in all age categories have fairly uniform death rates. Predation affects all age categories and is primary means of death. Typical of organisms that reach adult stages quickly. Examples: rodents, perennial plants, like I said, songbirds again, will have a continual decline as they get older. There's no, it's not any sort of age group is more susceptible to death than any other one. So that's constant loss, type 2 survivorship curves. Finally, type 3 is early loss, where we do not have a lot of organisms surviving at early birth. With ones slowly, we have that large middle, and then we have a early loss. We basically lose a lot in the onset, and that's oysters, an example of oysters. Typical of species that have great numbers of offspring. So those are strategists. Okay, they reproduce most of their lifetime. Death is prevalent for the younger members of the species, and then it declines with age. As far as loss goes, examples are sea turtles. Great example. When they first hatch out of the nest, they're trying to get down to the beach area and into the water. Before they can get down there, they're getting picked off by raccoons digging up their nests. ghost crabs, seabirds, all sorts of stuff, raccoons, foxes, all sorts of things moving, alligators, on the beach, picking those off before they can actually get to the water. Once they get to the water and they get out past the coast, they're pretty much good to go and they'll actually survive. But like I said, only a few of those will. So a majority of their death happens very quickly for them. Okay, so there's our 3 survivorship curves. Number 1, late loss, which is us. Number 2, constant loss, which are birds for the most part. And type 3, which is early loss. Those are our strategists. All right, let's look at human populations now. We spent a little time on kind of the general trend in populations. Let's look at human populations. There's many different factors that affect human population. We've seen historical population size by looking at history, population distribution, where are those populations located around the world, fertility rates, so how fertile is that population, how many babies are they having, growth rate kind of means how many babies are surviving compared to the ones that are dying, doubling times, how fast are we doubling our population in size, and demographic transition, which means based upon our culture, how is our population changing? So age structure diagrams act as indicators of future population trends, and we'll look at those in just a little bit. So those are our kind of different things we're going to look at in this section of human population. Historical population size. So rapid growth of the world's human population over the past 100 years has been due to primarily decrease in death rates. So the reason why all these organisms are surviving is because of the fact that, because we've decreased our death rates, which means we've got better health care and sanitation and things like that. In 1900, the overall death rate in the United States was 1.7%. In 2000, it's almost dropped by, it's almost a percent, it's only at 0.9%, almost half. Children in 1900 were 10 times more likely to die than children in the year 2000. So there's a couple different factors that have reduced death rates. Again, number 1, increased food and more efficient distribution of food to get better nourishment to organisms, specifically humans. Number 2, improvements in medication and also public health technology. Number 3, improvements in sanitation and personal hygiene. And the big one, number 4, is safe water supplies. Now, the human population has had 3 surges of major growth. And these surges in population have been attributed to 3 factors. The first one was tools and fire. We got tool, fire, and we got population growth out of that. The second was agricultural revolution, when we got better at farming and monopolizing certain crops. When humans stopped being hunters and gatherers and began to raise crops, that kind of stemmed that second surge. And the third was the industrial and medical revolution. With that, it's been happening within the last 200 years or so. So this book differs a little bit here. It talks about, it gives some definition. I'm going to go off this one for you and talk about birth rate and crude birth rate. Birth rate or crude birth rate is equal to the number of live births per 1,000 members of a population in 1 year. The death rate is the opposite. It's the equal number of deaths per 1,000 members of the population in 1 year. Immigration, and kind of basically is explaining this equation right here. Immigration refers to the number of individuals that enter a population or come into a population that we're looking at, while emigration, kind of the E stands for exit there, refers to the number of individuals leaving a population. So population change is calculated just by this. So you've got crude birth rate plus immigration. Those are all increasing populations. You've got to subtract, though, the number of deaths, crude death rate, plus emigration, so people leaving. So that's kind of how you calculate population change. Good equation to know. They might give you an example like this, like in this is 1950, the population of a small suburb in Los Angeles or LA, California was 20,000. The birth rate was measured at 25 per 1,000 per year, while the death rate was measured at 7 per 1,000 population per year. Immigration was measured at 600 per year, while emigration was measured at 200 per year. By how much did this increase? Now, you got 25 per 1,000, but you've got 20,000. So that's where you get the 20 from right there. So you have to multiply 20 by the 25, add in your 600 that immigrated into your country, subtract the crude death rate, which is the 7 per 1,000. Again, we have 20,000, so we've got to subtract, we've got to multiply that, and then add in our people that left or emigrated out. And we do that equation, we get a positive. We have a growth of 760 people. Now, in the new edition of this book, they talk about just estimating the growth rates. And to figure out the growth rates, it's almost exactly the same thing, except you divide this equation right here by each side of it underneath by 10, and that gives you a percentage of growth rate. So they give you a little bit different example, but very, very similar in the new edition of the AP Barron's book. But again, they might ask you for either. They might ask you for how many actual individuals grew or lost, or by growth rate percentage. Probably by growth rate percentage if it's in the new edition. All right. So the current world growth is approximately 1.3% when applied to about 6 billion people, yields around 85 million people annually, which means we get 85 million new people a year. Because of this large and increased population size, the number of people added to the global population will remain high for several decades, even if our growth rate declines. So even as of right now, our growth rate slows down and goes in the opposite direction, we're still going to have a lot of people on the planet. As far as the graph goes, it just kind of shows you how long it took us to get to 6 billion, but now we're at 7 billion. It's kind of crazy to think about this is where we're at right now, and we'll probably grow up to 8 or 9 billion, even before, let's say, before 2022 or 2200 or 2200. Distribution-wise, in 1800, a vast majority of the world resided in Asia and in Europe. By 1900, 25% of human population lived in Europe, largely because of the Industrial Revolution. They were becoming more sophisticated in technology, and people moved that direction. But between 2000 and 2030, most of the growth will occur in less developed countries like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, whose growth rates remain much higher than our, like us, the United States, and a more developed country. The more developed countries in Europe and North America will have growth rates less than 1%, and some countries like Russia, Germany, Italy will actually experience negative growth rates based on what their population looks at now. So your book gives you an interesting diagram. I actually kind of like this one better in the old edition, but it talks about distribution of, it's a little bit different. It says distribution of the last billion people on Earth. So I guess since we've reached 7 billion. So they're showing different things. This one shows human distribution patterns in 1800, and then shows them in 2050, kind of where it's kind of talking about what we talked about here. Inside the new edition of the Barron's book, it kind of talks about where on the planet did just this last billion come from? Where are they at locally? So this kind of talks about the overall region, kind of comparing old to new. This talks about where in that 7th billion, billion people that came onto the earth, where they come from. In the book, in the new edition, it says Asia has 57% of those new 1 billion people. Africa is 28%. Latin America is 9%. North America is 4%. Europe's 1%, and Oceania is only 1% as well. So just kind of interesting to look at where is that growth right now as far as human history goes. All right, human population growth. We can take a look at basically the overall gist in time period. Before the agricultural revolution, description, we had 1 million to maybe 3 million humans. They were all hunters and gatherers lifestyle. 50 million humans increased to advances in agriculture and domestication of animals by the end of the nomadic lifestyle. And their early viewpoint as far as the earth goes was called the earth wisdom view, where the natural cycles can serve as a mode for human behavior. That's the earth wisdom view of that time. In 5000 BC to 1 BC, 200 million humans were on the planet. Rates of a population growth during this period were increasing a little bit. It had a frontier worldview where it viewed undeveloped land as hostile wilderness, needs to be cleared and planted and exploited for its resources as quickly as possible because striking while the iron is hot is good. From kind of 0 to 1300 CE, 500 million humans, so we increased by about 300 million. Population rate increased during the Middle Ages because the new habitats were discovered. Factors that reduced population rate during this time were famines, wars, diseases, things like that. In 1300 to 1650, we had 600 million, so we grew by 1 million there. Plagues reduced population growth rates up to 25%. So that's why we kind of slowed in growth there. And then those plagues reached their peak around the mid-1600s. So after the 1600s to the present, we currently have 6 billion humans. We jumped hugely in just that last jump there. From 0.1%, today it's 1.3%. So healthcare and health insurance, vaccine, medication, Medicaid, Medicare, preventative cares, advancement in drugs, all those things have helped to have our population explode. And now we have what we call a planetary management view, where beliefs that as the plant is the most important. We are the most important species on the planet. We are in charge of the earth. We will not run out of resource because our ability to develop, to find new ones. And the potential for economic growth is essentially unlimited, and our success depends on how well we manage Earth's life support system, mostly for our own benefit, not for everybody else's. Now, we do predict that this viewpoint will change, hopefully by now. That's the reason why I'm trying to teach this class, to the 2050 and so forth. Estimates that we can grow as a high of 15 billion people on the planet. And that, if we're at 7 billion now, that would be doubling our population, which is insane. We would take the Earth wisdom view, beliefs that nature exists for all Earth species, that we are not in charge on the Earth. Resources are limited and should not be wasted. We should encourage Earth-sustaining forms of economic growth and discourage Earth's degrading forms of economic growth. So our success depends on how the Earth sustains itself and integrating such lessons from nature into our own daily lives. So that's kind of why my whole reason for teaching this course, that Earth wisdom viewpoint, and hopefully we can inflict a change before we get to that big, large number right there. That could be devastating for the Earth. Let's take a look at fertility rates. One of the type of fertility rates is RLF, which stands for replacement level fertility, in which a couple only has enough children to replace them. So it's usually about two. One child for me to replace me when I die, and one child for my spouse when she dies. Okay, it takes basically a replacement level fertility of 2.1 to replace each generation, since some children will die before they grow. So it's usually around 2, usually a little bit higher than 2 by just a tenth there. Replacement level fertility rates are lower in moderately developed countries and higher in less developed countries due to higher infant mortality rates. Obviously, because the less health care and health quality, they're going to have a higher number because there are more children that are going to die in infancy. The country of Niger in Africa actually leads the world in total fertility rate at 7.46, and total fertility rate is the average number of children that each woman will have during her lifetime. So that's the average. Having 7 kids, that's kind of insane. I mean, it's not insane. It's just crazy to think about having 7 children. That's the average. Some people are having 14, 15, 16. 7 is an average. So that's very, very interesting. In the United States, our total fertility rate is around 2.1. So we're at pretty much replacement level fertility right now. Well, or 2.09, or around 2.1. Despite of half the world's population having a sub-replacement fertility rates, the world population is still growing. As you look at places like Russia, Hong Kong, Japan, Europe, they're a lot lower than RLF. And so this growth is due to nations with above replacement, obviously a higher TFR, and a population momentum caused by large numbers of younger females who have not yet had children yet. So that's kind of where most of our growth, again, coming from those developing nations. Declines in fertility rates can be attributed to several factors. Urbanization results in higher cost of living, reduces the need for extra children to work on farms like we did way back in the day in United States history. There is a greater personal acceptance and governmental encouragement of contraception and abortion to manage that population and manage the number of children born to a man and woman. The number of females in the workforce and female educational opportunities are increasing. And that is I think that's been probably the strongest of all of them. And more individuals desire to increase their standard of living by having less children. You have less children, that means everybody in your family actually lives better. Many people are postponing marriage until their careers are established, and then even having kids later as well. 2 main effects of total fertility rate being less than 2.1 without additions through immigration or our population decline and population aging. In the U.S., TFR has been inconsistent. The greatest TFR occurred in the post-World War II years, the baby boomer era, and new immigrants and their descendants are projected to contribute to 66% of the expected growth by 2050. And this is kind of saying, we've talked about this before, and maybe you've heard this before, that the Caucasians will be, basically be a minority because of we have new immigrants coming in and having lots of children in our country. So that is kind of a statement that the A.P. Barron's book agrees with as well. Taking a look at growth rates and doubling times, in the 20th century saw the largest increase in world population in human history. The following charts kind of show those doubling times of world population. You can see that how long it's taken to double. Back in the day, it took 650 years to double our population. As of where we are right now, it's only going to take us 50 years. The last two doubles of our population only took 50 years. As far as doubling our populations is concerned. So that's kind of a scary thought overall. It says, note the doubling times from 1925 to 1975 are projected from 75 to 2025 remain constant. This does not mean the world is not increasing in population. It means the growth rate has decreased, shown in the following figures. So I believe this is the yearly growth rate of human populations from 50 to 2010. Let's take a look at this. And I think your book talks a little bit about, it shows that exact same image, but it's not the same image. It's a little bit different. It's the same exact stats, but just shown with a couple that shows population at a slope and also shows growth rate. So it actually, just has growth rate. This has a population growth in it as well. So it's got a little bit of a difference there, but for the most part, it's pretty much the same. All right. The rule of 70. So this is one thing I did not discuss during my teaching of AP Environmental Science, but the rule of 70 is a useful rule of thumb that roughly explains the time periods involved in exponential growth at a constant rate. To find the doubling time of a quantity growing at a given annual percentage rate, divide the percentage number into 70 to obtain the approximate number of years it's required to double. For example, at a 2% growth rate, the annual doubling time is 35. So 70 divided by 2, 35. To find the annual growth rate, divide 70 by the doubling time. For example, 7 divided by 35 would be 2% growth rate. So that's the rule of 70. Good thing to go over. I highly recommend going back over that. Throw some different numbers in the equation just so you got a pretty good base of how to do it. But the rule of 70 probably will come up on the AP exam. All right, let's take a look at demographic transition. We spent some time on this in my class. Taking a look at the different stages of how our population has changed due to basically how we've grown and done with our culture. But the demographic transition occurring in human populations are the same for all countries, but the U.S. has a pretty good example of looking at all these together. Stage 1, pre-industrial. Living conditions are severe. Medical care is poor, non-existent. The net result is little population growth. This is like when we first came over to the United States. Conditions were harsh. We didn't have the best medication. We didn't grow very fast. That would be a great example of stage 1. Stage 2 is transitional. The stages occurs after the start of the industrialization, so kind of after we started the Industrial Revolution. Standards of hygiene advance, Medicare and medical care advances, improved sanitation, cleaner water supplies, vaccinations, things like that. They drive down the death rate, which leads to significant upward trend in population size. So we're starting to grow a little bit there. An example right now would be India, Pakistan, Mexico of a transitional one there. Stage 3 is industrial. Urbanization decreases the economic incentives for larger families, so we don't need a lot of kids to go work in the mills and the mines and things like that. We can slow our we can slow our growth down a little bit as far as having kids. The cost of supporting an urban family grows, so we got to pay more for everybody. The parents are more actively discouraged from having larger families. Education and work opportunities from a decrease. Birth rates, obtaining food is not a major focus of the day. And leisure time is available. And what that does is retirement, basically what it does is the birth rate starts to drop a little bit, ultimately coming close to the death rate, so it's kind of an even keel. It says an example is China right now. Stage 4 is post-industrial, and this is where the birth rate equals the mortality rates, and the zero population growth is achieved. Birth and death rates are both relatively low. Standard of living is much higher during the earlier periods. In some countries, birth rates may actually fall below mortality rates. And the result is a net loss in population, so the population is starting to decline. Russia, Japan, European Union are examples of these. Now, there's the overall deal. The new book and the new edition actually talks about stage 5. It's called sub-replacement fertility. And this is the original demographic transition model, has just 4 stages, but theorists think there's a 5th stage that needs to be added. And this is needed to represent countries that have sub-replacement fertility, which is below 2.1 per woman. Most European and many East Asian countries now have a higher death rate than birth rates in this stage. So although we said, this is a characteristic of a post-industrial, they think it differs a little bit from post-industrial because they're much lower and their populations are on the decline. So that some theorists think we should split that into two and relook at that, but that's what the new edition states. All right. Age structure diagrams are good indicators of future trends in population growth. And what we do is we take a look basically at where are we at as far as people right now. It's why we take surveys and take censuses and things like that. We're looking at age and also percentage of male and female and kind of where those people lie as far as age goes. Now, this can help us determine if our population in the future is going to grow, stay the same, or decline pretty much. So in a less developed country, I think your book or the new edition of the book actually gives examples like a rapid growth, and this area would be, I think they give Nigeria as an example. And basically you just have a broad base. You have a lot of younger children or a lot of lower aged individuals, and what that says is that those individuals are eventually going to be reaching these reproductive age years, from about 20 to 30 and 40, and your population is going to grow significantly more because your base is larger than the top. When you get to a more developed country, and this is kind of what it would look like, but in 1999, by 2050, you would see your population actually kind of even out again eventually, but it is going to grow. And then you look at a more developed country where it's at more of kind of an even kill. There's more 40 to 50-year-olds, and it's kind of not going to grow a ton. You can kind of see it's not going to be growing. Actually, the growth is going to not really come, but you're going to see more individuals up in that top age group rather than in the lower age group. That means your country is probably going to either stay the same or decline a little bit or slightly. And so they give you a couple examples. U.S. is kind of a slow growth right now. If your population is looking like this and it's top heavy, you're going to see probably a drastic drop, or at least a somewhat drastic drop in individuals. And I guess Germany would somewhat be like that right now. The European Union might be a little bit more like that, a little bit more older people in that area of the world. This book gives Mexico as the example. You can see the broad-based pyramid here on both sides, male and female, having large numbers of young children. And then you can kind of see it obviously growing overall out to the five. Where all these areas were much slower, you can see by 2050 that this population will be much larger, and it will eventually equal itself in age groups as far as numbers of people in those age groups. All right, population size. This section discusses several different things. It provides economic incentives to have fewer children, empower and educate women. These are things to kind of lead to sustainability for populations. Education usually leads to higher income. Higher income decreases the need for having extra children again, so you're not having as many kids. And higher education usually results in having children later in life as well. All right, I'm not going to go over these too much because we went over this a lot already in class, but China versus India, taking a look at their case studies on national policies that were implemented by their nation, and taking a look at how, which one worked better, as far as to lower their population size. We talked about this in class as a quick summary. China, had the one-child policy, and they enforced that pretty, they had ways of enforcing that, and that actually led to, a large drop in their total fertility rate, whereas India was promoting, family planning and things like that, but they didn't promote it very well, and it didn't catch on, and so therefore their population growth rate did not, or their TFR did not go down nearly as much as China's did. So there's a little case study comparison that we've already kind of talked about. Impacts of population growth. There are a couple different ones. Hunger. A large portion of the world's population, 25% actually, is malnourished. Areas of the greatest malnutrition are Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America. And consequently, these are the areas of the highest TFR, total fertility rates. And several factors contribute to malnutrition. One of those is poverty. Another one is droughts, which would have obviously less food. Number 3, populations have surpassed their carrying capacity. Too many for that would actually be that land to withhold. Number 4, political instability and wars, which may cause mass migrations for people moving out of that area. 5, pestilence. And number 6, foreign investors who own large land holdings whose sole motivation is profit in selling food to the highest bidder. So we're not just going to give food and evenly distribute it. Whoever has the most money wins, and that's kind of how, unfortunately, some of this has gone. This is an image in your text, in your book, that shows the different worldwide malnutrition. Where is this located? More than 30% of that country is malnourished. You can see Africa, Asia, Latin America, somewhere around there, and then you can see 20 to 30% there. So just kind of an interesting viewpoint. Obviously, we don't even know in the United States. It's kind of unknown, or maybe even unclassified in some of these dark areas, which are probably like Antarctica and places like that. All right. Advances made during the first and second green revolutions, which focused on food production, are not ending world famine. And India, Mexico, and the Philippines, where large advances were made in crop production, famine is still common. Exports from these and other poor countries caused by distributors receiving higher profits from richer countries like the United States, and actually making famine worse in those countries that are producing this type of food. Profit motives result in removal of food from the countries that grow it and sending it to other countries to get money, to pay higher prices. But unfortunately, that doesn't feed that country, and those people starve and are malnourished in those countries. Large-scale agribusiness or corporate ownership of farmland will not solve world hunger. Land reform in Japan, Zimbabwe, Taiwan, and Brazil has redistributed land to smaller holdings. It's also raised agricultural output as an average of 80%. Now, is that still staying in that country? Who knows, but that is a good motion there. The issue of malnutrition is not that the world does not produce enough food. It's that people can't afford it, and it's not evenly distributed. Like I said, there's probably enough food on the planet for everybody, but it's just not evenly distributed. We've got people who are very affluent, or in countries that are very affluent, hogging kind of all the food, and other places where they're not getting nearly as much food. So those are a couple things on malnutrition. Let's take a look at AIDS. And the textbook, or the new edition of the A.P. Barron's book, talks a lot more about AIDS than this one, but we'll kind of hit on some of those things there. Taking a look at AIDS. But in the United States, more than 500,000 people have died from complication arising from AIDS since 1981. An estimated 15,000 currently die annually, according to the Federal Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. More than 1 million people in the U.S. are living with the virus right now, and 40,000 become infected each year. African Americans make up approximately 13% of the U.S. population, account for half of the new U.S. infections, and third of all AIDS-related deaths. African American males are 7 times more likely than a Caucasian male to be infected with HIV. African American females are 20 times more likely to be infected as Caucasian females. And the fastest growing population in the United States for new infections are from 15 to 24 years old, people who are not being smart and wearing protection and things like that when having sex. So that is kind of some scary stats to look at, but that is the real deal of it all. The book differs here as far as graphs go. This says new cases of AIDS in the United States over the years. The new text actually shows a comparison of AIDS diagnosed and also death from AIDS. So we have seen a drop as far as the image goes. I can't show it to you now, but if you're looking and following that 5th edition, you can see that the image, the line, the difference in those between the area of those lines between. Has gotten greater and greater as time has gone on, because we have had better medications and better ways of dealing with AIDS. Now, AIDS is not cured. That is a definite thing, and that we have. No one said we have a cure for AIDS. There are things that have helped to combat the issues with AIDS, but never a cure has been found. The pandemic of AIDS began in the early 1980s. With currently 7,000 new HIV infections a day in the world. AIDS is the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the new, I know we don't have this here, but the new text talks a lot more about AIDS. It says, with 5,000 people worldwide dying each day due to AIDS. About half the new adult HIV infections occur among 15 to 24 years old. We've talked about that before. Approximately 97% of people living with HIV and AIDS live in low to middle income countries. Sub-Saharan Africa is the hardest hit region and is home to 2/3 of all the people living with HIV worldwide. Parts of Asia and Latin America are experiencing severe epidemics at the national or local level, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia is a region with the fastest growing HIV and AIDS epidemic in the world. They give you an image in the new text that talks a little bit more about, just kind of shows you the makeup of how many people have it currently, at least known worldwide, and where those percentages lie on a pie graph there. The economic impact of AIDS is kind of interesting as well. For many less developed countries with higher incidence of HIV, the disease affects economic growth by reducing human capital. If you don't have people to work, Therefore, you're not going to make money for your country. Those infected require significant medical care, straining emerging economies. So they're not being able to grow economically because they're spending some money on, on cures and treatment for those patients. Higher mortality rates also create a smaller skilled labor force, which results in smaller tax base, which in turn reduces the resource available for public expenditures. And again, like I said, no workers equals no revenue for your country. Worldwide, at least 25 million people have died from AIDS, and 2.8 million died in 2006, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization. AIDS could kill 31 million people in India and 18 million people in China by 2025, according to projections by the UN. The toll from AIDS for over the next 25 years will go far beyond 34 million people thought to have died from the bubonic plague in the 14th century, or 20 to 40 million people who perished in the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. AIDS is the leading cause of death in Africa, which has accounted for nearly half of all globe AIDS deaths, and the epidemic is still growing. The peak could be a decade or more away, and at last 7 countries, the UN estimates that AIDS has reduced life expectancy to 40 years or less. Botswana has the highest HIV prevalence in the world, with 36% of the country's 1.6 million people being HIV positive. So, kind of some scary things to think about there. Their life expectancy was at 47% in Botswana, and now is reduced to literally 27 years old. That is the average life expectancy of a person born recently in Botswana. That's kind of sad to think about. Pandemics also, major impact. Obviously, AIDS is a pandemic as well, but pandemics in general have caused, has caused, major problems with population, economy as well. The Spanish influenza, we mentioned that in the previous thing there. 28% of all Americans infected. It's been cited as the most devastating pandemic in recorded world history, but maybe AIDS will outdo it, unfortunately, unless we come up with something. According to the World Health Organization, if a mutant form of a bird flu virus like H5N1 develops, it could pass from person to person. It could kill as many as 7 million people worldwide and nearly infect nearly 1/3 of the world's population. So could be kind of scary. And I know there's been lots of movies made about pandemics and things like that, but the fact of the matter is that is kind of a scary thought. Other diseases, tobacco-related illnesses, including heart disease, cancer, respiratory disorders, all those are relatively preventable. As far as tobacco, if you don't smoke tobacco, you're least likely to get those kind of things. Tuberculosis is the leading cause of death in many poorer countries as well, and its economic cost is supposed to be about $12 billion. And each year, about 500 million people die from malaria infections, over 1 million deaths, 75% of which among our children in Africa. It's kind of sad to see there, too. All right, resource use and habitat destruction. There are 3 methods to use here as far as 3 methods are used to estimate the effects on humans on patterns of resources utilization, measuring net primary productivity, estimating estimate how much impact that humans have on Earth, and examining finite resources from that draw conclusions on increasing productivity. NPP is the amount of solar energy converted into biochemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. But we've got to subtract the plant's need to do respiration and grow itself. So that is what net primary productivity is. And again, the higher the net primary productivity, the more resources, and humans utilize about 27% of NPP for their own purposes, and so what's left over for the Earth as well. Humans use about 40% of the NPP and leave all of their life on Earth with 60%. The difference grows with every increasing human population, or every human that's born, that difference increases. Of the NPP of oceans, about 8% is utilized for human purposes. If humans utilize 100% of the NPP, leaving nothing for their life forms on Earth, the theoretical maximum sustainable human population at 100% of the carrying capacity would be about 15 billion people, which is kind of what we projected at, which I don't want to see that happen to my Earth, I'll tell you that much. Factors that affect resource utilization, carrying capacity, energy resources, environmental degradation, exploitation of natural resources, extinction of animal species, famines, political unrest, population density, poverty, technological development goes on and on. A few factoids for you there. Between 39 and 50% of the Earth's surface has been converted for either agriculture or urban purposes. CO2 concentration have increased 30% because of human activity. More than 50% of all easily accessible freshwater resources are utilized by humans. More than 50% of nitrogen fixation is caused by human activity, and humans have disrupted and introduced more than 25% of all plant species into non-native continental areas, and in some areas it's up to 50%. One case study, and then we're done for this lesson, is the Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. 1994 plan called for improved health care and family planning services for women and families throughout the world. It also emphasized importance of education for girls as a factor to shift to smaller families. So this is it for Chapter 6. Make sure you take a look and review over the checklist to make sure you've got everything down pat on populations and population growth and the population dynamics as well. Take a look at those 20 questions, see how you do on them. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to click the side and allow it to drop down and ask any questions you might have on populations in Chapter 6. See you guys next time.